Getting a powerful item feels good, but what happens when you get the strongest item in the game? And I'm definitely not talking about something in the loot table. I'm talking about a secret item. An item that feels a little too strong. An item that you probably shouldn't have gotten in the first place. Believe it or not, there have been several times where players have accidentally received items that were only supposed to be for GMs. And what the players did next, well, you'll be surprised. There was this dude named Leroy Spells, and he and his guild were raiding through Wrath of the Lich King when all of a sudden he disconnected. Now, DCs, they happen all the time. It's not the biggest deal in the world. You just reload the game and log back in. So Leroy put in his account details and... worst case scenario. Now, if you played WoW back in the day, you know what that screen means. And if you didn't, let me explain. So in the early days of WoW, before the days where everyone had authenticators, it was pretty common to get hacked. Usually, the hacker would gain access through the email address associated with the account, and they'd go in and change your password and lock you out. Then, if you were already online at the time that the hacker tried to log in, it would knock you off so they could get in the game. Where you'd normally just reload the game, try to log back in, and boom, you'd be hit with this screen. And after double and triple checking to make sure that you didn't panic typo your password, a grim reality would begin to set in. You've been hacked. Now, when you were hacked back in the day, they didn't just take your gold. They literally took everything. They would sell every single item in your bags, your bank, and worst of all, they'd go through your character, they'd unequip all of your armor that you spent months farming, they would vendor it, and they'd take all the gold and send it to some burner account. Your main character would be left with nothing. And dude, if you had more than one character, they'd be cleaned out too. So by the time you finally managed to secure your account and log back in, this is what you'd see. Yup, a scantily clothed character with not a single copper to their name. And this is exactly what happened to Leroy Spells. They logged back in, ready to progress the latest raid with their guild, just to see their beloved character in rags. But it gets way worse. Leroy was actually an officer in the guild, and that comes with unrestricted and unlimited guild bank access, which you already know the hacker took full advantage of and cleaned the entire place out. And they also decided, you know what, let's just delete a couple of Leroy's characters too. So because of this hack, Leroy lost a bunch of his characters, all of his items on his account, and all of the items in the guild bank. But Blizzard did have a solution to restore all of his account and his lost items and his lost characters. Like I said before, this was a pretty common problem back in the day, so when Blizzard received tickets like this, they'd know what to do. Basically, you just open up a ticket saying that you've been hacked, listing out the damage that it done, and Blizzard would then try to restore whatever was lost. So that's exactly what Leroy did. But sadly, he never heard back. Now, this was around December 2008, and the situation would remain quiet until March 2009. Leroy was pretty much back to normal. He was back on the raiding roster. They were in the middle of a 25-man Obsidian Sanctum when all of a sudden they encountered a loot error. The GM of the guild, his name was Karate Chop, he accidentally gave an item to Leroy that was supposed to go to somebody else. So Leroy, being a good guildmate, decided to open up a ticket to see if Blizzard could give the item to the right player. And this time, they were actually pretty quick. They got the item restored, and then they followed up with Leroy asking if he had heard anything about his account that was hacked a couple of months ago. Leroy was like, nah, you guys kind of ghosted me, and then they went back and forth in the emails for a little bit, but he wasn't hopeful. But all of that would change in mid-April when Leroy would log back in to a fully restored account. Everything was there. His characters, his items, all of it. And on each one of his characters, there was an in-game mail from Blizzard, which, to be honest, is totally ordinary. When Blizzard restores items, they usually send them back to players through the in-game mail system. But hanging around on his lowly level 13 Warlock was an item that no one had ever seen before. A single shirt named Martin Fury. It had plus 34 stamina, plus 34 intellect, but an interesting flavor text that read, kills everything within a 30-yard radius. Cheater. Now, you would think that if somebody got an item with a flavor text that had the word cheater in it, they definitely, under no circumstances, would equip it, go into the latest and hardest raid with their guild, proceed to one-shot every boss, and earn a bunch of world first kills along the way, right? Wrong. Instead of opening another ticket, enlightening Blizzard upon their mistake, Leroy decided to send a tell to his GM, showing off this glorious shirt. Afterwards, they'd form a group for Ulduar, go in there just to test it, see if it worked, and yep, pretty much it one-shot the boss. Now, you would think this is where he'd pump the brakes. I understand before, but after testing the item, yeah, it should probably be sent back, right? Wrong again. Leroy and crew would not only go on to use the shirt, but they would bump up the difficulty to the max level and then proceed to one-shot 14 bosses, giving them multiple world first kills, a full suite of the best items in the game, and of course a childlike sense of wonder and glee. The hardest bosses in the game at the time that other guilds were taking hours and hundreds of attempts to progress on were just falling over to the might of the shirt. They were having the time of their lives, but this is where things went wrong because they decided to fly a little too close to the sun and got burned from it. They decided to go back in and re-kill the bosses because not everyone in their guild was able to be there for the first kills. Now they tried to keep it honest and started off by putting in some legitimate attempts, but obviously those didn't go as well because these were literally the hardest bosses in the game. They were not supposed to be easy. After a couple hours of being Boy Scouts, they decided, all right, let's just use the shirt. But the problem with doing this was that not everyone in the guild was in on the shirt. Now, this isn't confirmed or anything, but I believe that this mistake right here is what led to them getting caught. I think it's reasonable to believe that some of the people in there thought the boss was bugged, and they didn't want any loot on their account from what they thought was a bug. Because, you know, a GM would see that and maybe ban them for using, I don't know, an exploit, something like that. So those people who were scared of their accounts getting banned decided to submit a ticket explaining everything to Blizzard. Alternatively, a different story could have been that maybe word got out Leroy had essentially what was a kill the boss button, and some people didn't feel comfortable or got upset that he had this, so they decided to rat him out to the GMs. Regardless of how it actually went down, Judgment Day would come, and boy was it intense. Both Leroy Spelts and Karate Chops were permanently banned. Anyone who was in the raid received a temporary ban, and anyone who was in the guild who was online at the time, regardless of whether or not they were in the raid, were locked out of their account for 24 hours. So, was it worth their entire accounts? Probably not, but I gotta admit, walking around one-shotting the hardest content in the game probably felt pretty good. So for the next one, we've got a pretty weird item from vanilla. This secret legendary item is one of the rarest in the game, and the funny thing is, it was added by mistake. Now back then, there were a ton of strange items, from wonky stats to super rare items and mysterious ones too. The game was still pretty fresh, and this was before the era where guides and online resources were commonplace. So when this item called the Talisman of the Binding Shard dropped, people just thought it was another rare and mysterious item. But this time, things were different, because the Talisman actually wasn't supposed to be in the game. Originally, the Talisman was just a testing item for a quest for another legendary in the game called Thunder Fury, Blessed Blade of the Windseeker, which was incredibly sought after at the time. Now, in order to get this quest done, you had to spend a ton of time in a raid called the Molten Core. And this is where things went wrong, because Molten Core was actually supposed to be cut from the original release of WoW, but the developers felt like it was really necessary to be out there, so they decided to work overtime and got it done within a week. Massive developer W, but the problem is when you fly that fast, things are bound to fall through the cracks. And this brings us to the Talisman. At some point during the raid's development, the devs decided to remove the quest the Talisman was associated with, but they forgot to remove it from the loot table. And because of this mistake, eventually a player called Nocton would get it to drop. And I mean, this thing was juiced. It had a ton of resistance on it, a pretty decent stat line, a chance to proc some damage on hit, and even a nice visual lightning ball effect. Now, as soon as this thing dropped, Blizzard went back and removed it from the loot table. But surprisingly, they would let Nocton keep his. And years later, they would put a nice little Easter egg in the game for him by adding an NPC in Ashran called Warlord Nocton with the same little lightning ball effect that the Talisman had. Honestly, a pretty cool way of looking back and laughing at a mistake. Alright, this next one's not really an item, but it's a group of GM items that surrounds a very specific and weird character. It's a level 84 warrior called Melisong on the Illidan servers, and he's fully decked out in GM-specific gear. So GMs have a very special outfit, almost like a uniform that they get, right? It's just a few cloth items, but it has a very distinct look. And again, only GMs are supposed to get it. But somehow, Melisong was able to get the full fit. Next, let's talk about their level. It's level 84, which on its own is not that suspicious. But he was somehow able to reach this without getting any of the level up achievements. Basically, how it works is when you level up and reach certain milestones like 20, 30, 40, etc., you get these cool achievements. But Melisong doesn't have a single achievement. Now, how this individual somehow managed to bypass a major progression tracking system is beyond me, But regardless, he's chilling at level 84, and the system somehow, for some reason, doesn't actually recognize it like it would normal characters. Now, this character used to be trackable on the armory, but Blizzard decided to take it down, which adds a little bit more spice to this story. A lot of it still remains shrouded in mystery, but there are 3 main theories. Number 1, this was just a test character that Blizzard was using to try and test out maybe the armory overhaul or some of their APIs, and they just forgot to take it down. Number 2, this was just an old GM character that got lost in the sauce, maybe when they were overhauling the game's progression system or decommissioning and upgrading some of their servers from back in the day. And number 3, this was just the character of a very talented individual who decided to hack Blizzard, put on some GM gear, and get some GM privileges as a big flex. Again, I don't really know, and no one really knows for that matter, so let me know what you guys think. And the last item we'll talk about is technically the rarest mount in the game. It's called the fluorescent green Mechano Strider, and its origins date back to an OG time in Blizzard's history where they would design a lot more than they could actually implement. This led to Blizzard designing a bunch of things like raids, zones, mounts that either never made it into the game or partially made it into the game, which basically resulted in a bunch of unused stuff lying around in the game files. Now, this wasn't completely out of the ordinary. In fact, it's a standard practice within game development, but they made a big mistake with this one because they accidentally gave it to a player. Everything was fine. It was just another day in the early days of WoW when somehow, suddenly, a dude named Narsh, who was playing a gnome, lost his mount. So he decided to open up a ticket and reach out to a Blizzard GM and ask them if they could restore it. And sure enough, they did. But they didn't give him his original mount back. Instead, they sent him the fluorescent green Mechano Strider by mistake. Now, this isn't the biggest deal in the world. Mounts are mainly cosmetic. It's not like they sent him, I don't know, a shirt or something that could one-shot a bunch of bosses, but still a pretty big oopsies. Now, I'm pretty surprised by this one, because after they discovered that Narsh had a one of only one mount, they decided to let him keep it, until Narsh tried selling his account. Now, once Blizzard caught wind of this, they popped him for RMT, which basically stands for real money transaction. Basically, it's exchanging in-game goods for IRL cash. And that's against the terms of service, so they shut down his account. And sadly, along with it, the only fluorescent green Mechano Strider in the game. But that's all we got. It looks like when players receive stuff they aren't supposed to, we get a range of reactions from wholesomeness to pure degeneracy. But I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, please hit me with a like and a sub. I'd really appreciate it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.